Hi everyone. Today I have Sasha Jones with me, and I've written a bit of blurb about Sasha because in fact there's quite a lot to say about her. So I've written a little bit so I can get it right, and then she will talk a bit about herself and what she's here to talk about. So, Sasha is a writer and comedian living in New Zealand. I use the word comedienne intentionally with Sasha's approval. Whilst we once didn't want to be discriminated against by using descriptions and nouns which referred to our female sex, we now may have to use them again due to gender ideology eradicating women from language altogether. Sasha was born in Australia, but when she married a Kiwi, she moved to live in New Zealand. However, she pops back and forward across the Tasman Sea between the two countries on a regular basis and refers to herself as TransTasmanian, which is also the title for her latest comedy routine, which she hopes to perform in the 2025 Melbourne Comedy Festival. Besides being a comedian, Sasha has written a few books, the latest one titled The Fatter Sex. We'll talk about that, and I'll put a link below to where it can be bought. First, though, we'll kick off by talking about the comedy circuit in New Zealand. As many of us have heard, the comedy circuit in other countries has become very upstanding about presenting only the correct sense of humour now. And recently, a comedian in Australia got cancelled for not being a good girl with correct humour. Sasha Sasha is not only not a good girl either, she is also an older woman who includes turf comedy in her routine. And it seems that they are sins that simply can't be borne in the comedy circuit, as has become increasingly obvious to her. Sasha, tell us a bit about how the comedy circuit operates here in New Zealand and when you first started spotting that not being the correct kind of woman or correctly funny could get you quietly cancelled.
Okay, that's a big question. I started stand-up comedy in 2016 and it went extremely well as far as the audiences were concerned. Like, off the scale, I got all sorts of incredibly positive feedback from audiences and MCs as well, so experienced comedians, some of the most experienced comedians in New Zealand, in fact. But yeah, the gatekeeping that was in place for basically my feminist comedy, it wasn't sort of openly turf at that point, because it was 2016 and we weren't, that wasn't the most prominent problem. But being a feminist comedian has always been tricky. Or being an older woman as well, of course, and an older woman feminist, it's just that
why has feminist comedy been tricky? Is it because the comedy circuit is like mostly men or something?
Yeah. It's almost the last bastion of sort of male dominated industry. A lot of the people running the show are men, and that's still true. Running all the clubs and the competitions, in fact. And yeah, those competitions were initially just like 9 out of 10 would be male, in a comedy lineup, or so you'd have your token woman in so many different shows and competitions. And then people like Hannah Gadsby, I think that she came onto the scene, the comedy scene, local Australia, New Zealand comedy scene, to change that. But she had and I'm trying to think of the exact year that she won the Raw Comedy competition in Australia. I entered the New Zealand one here, and I met that many years later, and I met Gatekeeping that totally stunted my progress in a way that I was so blatantly unfair that I took the person in charge of the comedy industry here to the Human Rights Commission on a sex and age discrimination complaint in 2018, December. And we met in mediation, and we're not allowed to share what went on in mediation, but it was pretty clear that my progress had been blocked. Really more to teach me a lesson. It wasn't turfism then, but it was just that not about my comedy. It was about me being a strong, outspoken woman who questioned things that didn't look right in the surrounding industry. Just standing up for myself, really, not trying to, fix the whole thing.
And was there no one else? Was there no other woman doing this?
Well, there were no other middle-aged women. There was one other middle-aged woman in the Raw Comedy Quest intake in my year. In 2017, I did Raw in 2017 and 2018. But she dropped out. So it really was just me in that age category.
Right. What does Raw
age
mean?
and sex category, yeah.
What does Raw mean?
Oh, it's called the Raw Comedy Quest. It's the national comedy quest to find the next new funniest comedian. Yeah,
so that other woman, she dropped out. She dropped out because just for her own reasons, or because it was
I think for her own reasons. It's actually it's very challenging it is challenging to be that much older than your average contestant. But as I said, I think because I've been a writer, I've been writing all my life, and so what I wrote was very funny from the beginning, which is usually you work up. It sounds like a brag, but one of the country's top MCs was literally on his knees on the stage, bowing down to me after my first gig, and the whole audience were cheering. It was like a Susan Boyle comedy moment. But then, the big boss running it wasn't happy with that. I think he wanted to, be the one to manage me. In fact, I was told it was like, seeing Ursula Carlson's first gig. Because of the naturalness, I was relaxed. Normally the nerves are a major thing, and I actually became more nervous as I went through the system. But when I started, for some reason, I just was saying, well, if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. I just wanted to see if I was funny, and I was. And so, I kind of was, and I also was a ballet dancer, so I grew up on the stage. I was very, quite high up in the Australian ballet scene as a teenager. And so I think that's part of why I was a bit more relaxed than the average newcomer. But I've also been around, and I don't know. It came naturally to me. I just wish I'd known I was comedically talented at a much younger age. And I didn't see all these token women in these lineups, which just made them less funny, because they just were like wearing the sign that said token woman. That's what it was like for me. I've watched a lot of comedy. My husband and I were both very interested in comedy. He's very funny too, but in a quieter way. But like I said, I didn't know I was actually, I could be a comedian. It just didn't look like a female-friendly environment at all. The 7 days was, invariably one woman, and and 8 men or 7 men or whatever. And it, that was every single week. That was the comedy we were presented with, and as far as TV went.
And do you know if there were actually quite a number of women who were trying to get in, or were they kind of just sort of put off right from the start, kind of knowing that they couldn't get in?
Well, I was certainly put off, and I'm pretty strident. So I can only guess that I don't know, because you don't see them. But I do know that 2 other middle-aged women, one of them certainly was talented, came and went in my time. So, but since then, it's sort of been quite a flooding influx of female comedians, mostly younger, but a few older as well. So, things have changed quite rapidly in recent years, but it seems to me that all those comedians, whether they were women, there were some women in the New Zealand comedy scene going right back, of course, and the newer ones coming in were just bought into the whole, transgender thing. And I couldn't do that. And in 2020, I came out on my regular Facebook page as a TERF, amongst other things that I used to describe myself. And the backlash from all my comedy contacts, I don't know, I would have had about 40 something people, mostly young, as I said, that's the industry, but a few of the mature members, and they just thought it was the most bigoted, prejudiced opinion, and they screamed at me, young males screaming at me, this is not going to affect your your rights at all. And I said, well, it's already affected my rights. I'd already had males in the female toilet, and it was incredibly uncomfortable, including one in a comedy lineup, and he's going to the toilet with the door open right next to me, and I come out,
standing up, urinating in the toilet
yes,
with the
yes,
door
without closing the door. And that's because the female and male toilets had been turned into, anyway, it was complicated, but basically they were both gender neutral.
Yeah, I've come across that myself. Yeah, and
I mean, you're already a minority in these lineups of comedy as a female, and it's so like they just don't care about your dignity or your comfort, and that so it's not a very funny encounter, and when you're treated like that. But this is not, that was sort of post that first cancellation, that was more due to the big boss not liking me speaking out about things, and indeed possibly I think even resenting the talent I showed on the first. I just walked off the street instead of him being able to nurture me and sort of take some credit in my journey from brand new rookie to a professional comedian. And he basically said he was going to put me through to the next level, but now I've ruined that by complaining. So he said, it's a shame. This is through the Human Rights Commission process. This part I can share. It's all in emails and whatnot. He said it's a shame that this was, and it was a shame because there were a lot of audience members, who were happy to see a new kind of comedy, a new age. I'm married, been married a long time. I've got 3 children, so I can talk about husband and children in a way. I'd do comedy sets and there were no other mothers there. I'd ask in the audience, any mothers out there, and there'd be no mothers. So it was not a very mother-friendly scene either. And I just think, we're a huge percentage of the population, and we've got a lot of stuff to talk about that's funny, and in a way that might even help. Art's supposed to sort of enhance people's understanding of humanity and people that are different from them. And if you haven't got mothers and married women who is can speak out about their experiences in a funny way, but also by there's all sorts of things that are not great, and so you make fun of those. And if they're not in the comedy industry, there's a lot of women, and not many of them, are mothers. And that's a real gap.
So I can see what you're saying. I can just from listening, hearing you talk about that, I can absolutely see what you're saying about this big gap. Because you're quite right. I'm not a mother, and that was just by my choice. But I've heard women throughout my life talking about their experiences with kids and stuff like that, and husbands and partners and a family and things, and like for example, and some of it is really funny. It's kind of dramatic, but sort of funny. And I do remember someone I knew who had twins and babies, and she was saying how she's trying to change the nappy on one while the other one's trying to eat its own poos. And so there's just sort of lots of stuff like that goes on with kids that women talk amongst themselves about, but which could be really sort of funny to actually sort of share in a comedy situation.
Absolutely. And also the wife needs to speak as well. But I mean, I've got a supportive husband, so I'm not doing it in a sort of, a lot of maybe women who just want to, bitch about their husbands. There's a bit of that in stand-up comedy. That's not quite what I do, but I do make fun. It's just, I think it's a fair fun, put it that way. He's been married to a feminist for a long time, so he gets it. He supports me. He's definitely a Terf, and that's a rare thing for a man. But he possibly wouldn't have been if he hadn't, been, living with me for so long. But our kids don't support us at all. So that's happened since this comedy cancellation. In fact, the estrangement from our children. So that's a less than funny element of my story. But again, and it's tied up with it because young people have just bought into this idea that you can be born in the wrong body, and that trans phobia is the big evil of the day. Sexism doesn't matter anymore. Even homophobia doesn't matter anymore, because it's just all about the trans. And it's mainly women who look like us who are pushing back against this. A few noble men are very brave, and they're suffering, are joining us, but it's mostly middle-aged women, straight and lesbian and bisexual and all sexualities are pushing back. And so the young people, that have joined the other side, it's a lot of anti-mother stuff in there as well. I feel anti-mother feeling, as I see in the estrangement community. It's mostly the mothers. There's fathers too that are estranged, but so
I have to commend you for sticking to your guns, because I do speak to a number of mostly women, I suppose there are men out there as well, but just who I speak to, who say things like they daren't say anything or speak out because their kids will basically hold them to ransom about it. Like, you speak up, you do this, and I won't talk to you anymore, or I won't let you see the grandchildren anymore. And these women capitulate to that because they're terrified of being cut off like that. So I mean, when I hear a woman like yourself who's just say, no, you can't, you're not going to do that to me, even though you understand the consequences, I just really admire that.
Well, thank you. As I said, I've been strident from really from the youngest age. I didn't pledge to obey my husband, and that was in the 80s, when you still was sort of expected, and I was only 21.
You didn't pledge to obey.
Well, that was the advice given we just had a marriage celebrant, because we're not religious, and that was the advice given in the vows. And it's just like, well, how can you love someone or be loved by someone when obedience is sort of formally required? Unless it's husband obedience. Now, look, I'd throw that in, because that would be useful, putting it in some kind of form. I mean, how can men know more about raising children and being in? Women are the ones that, we have the empathy. We're going to forgive. We're not going to go crazy and expect to, order the family around what our interests, It's so, as I said, I've studied family violence and all that, and it really, with men in charge, this idea that men are supposed to be in charge of families and countries, but really, countries just, a great big family. And is the fundamental mistake we've made. Women really have much more, the maternal instinct really is something quite powerful. And even if you don't have children, it's active. I feel that's my experience.
We haven't really made the mistake of letting men be in charge, have we? Because it's just a position they've taken because of their, they physically have been able to do that.
Well, I mean, the men have made the mistake, I suppose. Women hadn't had much say in it, but an awful lot of women go along with it, including my mother and my aunt. They're very, pro patriarchy. And again, they're not even religious, but the religious women can be very strident patriarchs, or supportive of the patriarchy for everyone else, possibly not for themselves so much. So women will sacrifice their own freedom. In the name of religion, in the name of all, doing what they believe is the right thing, and they've been taught and raised in these traditions.
They will,
So you have to be actively pushing against tradition constantly, from childhood, to be a feminist. If you're in a family like that, I am deeply envious. I loved my family, though. My family were funny. That's the thing. It's not straightforward. And I'm glad we weren't raised with religion. However, it's a bit of a mess now, because some of the anti-feminism has got nasty with the I won't name the people, but the resentment of my feminism has led to contributed to the estrangement of our children that way. Which is
look, I have to sort of say that, just going back to how men have positioned themselves to be in charge. now, and you know, I always used to look forward to the time when women got more of a share of that.
Mm.
And now, and now we have, and I look at the kind of woman, I look at the kind of women who have sort of got to the, have got to
Yeah.
be in charge of things, and I'm just bitterly disappointed with them, you know, because there's so many of them,
But the
you
thing
know,
is, Katrina, with if I
agenda
can jump in there,
ideologues.
yeah, the thing is that I feel is that feminism, it's just been soft feminism. The real feminism has been marginalized since its inception. You know, so the fighting for the vote, even though that's so basic to us now, that was, you know, required actual, you know, hunger strikes, you know,
Yeah,
physical protests, that were, and they were just, you know, condemned and mocked shamelessly, for that protest. That was just the right to participate in the democracy and not
yeah,
be seen as secondary humans that just raise children like we don't have brains. I actually think that for every male genius, there's a female who's slightly smarter. That's what I feel. But you have to be, because we've got to keep them in check. They need, the brains are great. Well, actually, the brains can go. I mean, Stephen Hawking says he doesn't understand women. Women are a mystery. Well, I was like, well, read a book by women, Stephen. He's supposed to be our smartest person. We never say a female's our smartest person, do we? It's always a male. So he's the
yeah.
current one. I don't know how he's doing now. This is what I read recently, but recent-ish. He's obviously incredible with his physical struggles, but so was his wife. He didn't learn anything about women from his wonderful wife. How does
Well,
that
people who
work?
often people who are very successful are very egotistical as well, and that's
Mm,
that ego that drives them to be successful, and which stops them from actually sort of thinking too much about others around them and
yes.
primarily about themselves. And that's, you know, that's the drive in
Mm,
a lot of ways. It doesn't mean to
mm,
say always that they're awful people, but they're just very much instinct or and whatever, instinctively, whatever, just very focused on themselves, and that drives their success. To go
yes.
back to the boss of the New Zealand comedy circuit,
Mm-hmm.
when you say the boss, is this person, now he's obviously a he, is he in
Mm.
charge of like the whole of New Zealand?
Well, that is a very, very good question. He runs the only comedy club in New Zealand, and all the comedy awards are run through his club, and he runs the Raw, single-handedly runs the Raw Comedy Quest, which is the gatekeeping for new talent to come into the industry, and he's been doing that for 20 years. And you know, so having it one male, one old-fashioned male, let's just call him an old-fashioned male, um, you know, running that gatekeeping, new the comedy industry is a massive amount of power. And you know, some of the female comedians that have been in the New Zealand comedy scene for years, you know, are loyal to him. Um, but they came through as sort of token women. There's a good, you know, 5 of them, let's say, but it was still, compared with the, hundreds of men, it's a token, sort of, you know, they got through in that
Yeah.
sort of context. Now we
Are
have to
the women,
compete. Yeah.
do the women tend to be a bit like devotees or something like that?
Well, younger males and females, you know, they're just, when they enter the comedy industry. Yeah, he's the big boss, and they do sort of,
Oh yes, I can understand that.
yeah,
They
they
would, yeah,
do look up to him, and you know, expect
yeah.
him to, you know,
And they do
they do his
kowtow a
bidding.
bit because they don't want to queer their pitch, you know, they don't want to ruin their chances and stuff like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't come in blazing with all this feminism. I didn't. I actually, believe it or not, I got into comedy to get out of feminism because it had so worn me out in academia. You know, obviously, I went to the darkest side of sexism and misogyny with domestic violence and homicide for my PhD. But so I really, I was suppressing my sense of humour and comedic impulses, to put it mildly, and art creative impulses altogether for that. And I needed to get out of that because I wasn't coping. Um, my mental health was struggling, and so I got, yeah. I started writing first, and I wrote tragicomic memoir, And then I, at all these book launches, I had a few launches, you know, everyone was laughing, not just at what I was reading, but just at at my brother's wedding, everyone was laughing. I gave a funny speech without even really sort of trying, but it wasn't accidentally funny. It was actually, anyway, so a few things added up to me wanting to start comedy, but that was one of the reasons I thought, well, this is, you know, I'm going to focus on humor rather than feminism and politics. But I walked straight into, not only was Trump elected the month after I started, and you know, then the man running the show seemingly took offence with the suggestion of the MC that I should be fast-tracked through the raw process, because I guess, I mean, obviously with my age, I don't have an endless time to get into the industry, but also, as I said, my first gig was that impressive. That's what he said, that it was like seeing Ursula Carlson's first gig, and that I should be fast-tracked. I was ready to go, and the big boss wasn't happy with that, even though, you know, his MC is, you know, they're thick as thieves. He took it as me suggesting this fast tracking when it was his MC suggesting it. Obviously, I can't suggest it. I've just walked through the door. So I don't know, but if I took the word of the MC, experienced MC, award-winning MC, knows his comedy, and also a he. Anyway, but no, so the guy running it wasn't happy about that. And behind the scenes, he blocked my progress. I wrote a 25,000 word complaint, as I mentioned to you before, to the Comedy Guild, and to detail every way this man blocked my progress and tried to make it look like it wasn't, tried to undermine my performances actively. Which you can do when you've got that much power. And again, that's too much power.
Well, 25,000 words, there's obviously were a lot of complaints in that. Or lots
I had
lots
to
of
detail
demonstrable situations in there. Yeah.
But yeah, it turns out the Comedy Guild is not impartial either, and it's basically in cahoots with it. This man has too much power. I've seen a lot of complaints on the funny birds. I might get cancelled from that. I'm still on it. But it's called Funny Birds, and it's a Facebook group for female comedians in New Zealand, female comedians and producers, and they accept non-binaries, which means men. And they have, well, you know, if they identify, they're getting, you know, they're seeing that the downside of that, as I check in fairly regularly, I don't comment that often, but some of the older women, as well as these young women coming through, who have been supportive of non-binary and trans women and women, rah-de-rah, are now sort of seeing the downside of this.
Is that right?
You know,
and they're making like little comments to indicate
some of it's just traditional sexism that they're experiencing on the comedy circuit, of being intimidated when these gigs are at night. It was a horrible, tragic murder of a female comedian in Melbourne a few years ago. Just absolutely, she'd done this great gig, and then just walking home, she was raped and murdered. And then this horrible male comedian who actually had a television gig at that stage, he actually drew this massive penis and balls next to the actual site that it was a commemoration site that had been set up on the grass in the park where she'd been killed. Yeah. That's what he thought was funny. And so he got taken down, by comedians, but it's still, that's the level of sexism that can exist in a comedy community from men who really resent women coming into it.
So
and even though in New Zealand, if you really want some of the juice here, we've got the other what can happen, and I believe the comedy boss here has done since my complaint, because I was very public, I had nothing to lose by this stage, when he really played his final card extraordinarily in 2018. And again, you need 25,000 words to explain the details, but so I just was, open about what I felt, and I can't remember what I was going to say then. That was unfortunately. I've lost
to go back to the sexism. Do you think that this is what these younger women now, and maybe you say some of the older ones, the ones have all been, like, welcoming to the non-binary and trans, everything. You think it's just plain old sexism that they're now seeing, that these men who say they're woman or non-binary are actually getting more.
Well, I mean, because if you don't study feminism, you don't really make these distinctions. And there's plenty of women who still call themselves feminists who are buying into the trans ideology. They don't see it as a direct threat to women's rights, women's power, women's access to, equality and non-discrimination. It's basically a men's rights movement. They don't, but few see it like that, although things are now changing. But this was, like I said, in 2020 when I came out as a TERF, the males and females pounced on me and said the most horrific things, condemning me as just this absolute horrible person. And, who doesn't know what she's talking about at all. And I'm talking about feminism, which is something I've got a degree in, and these are 20-year-olds telling me I haven't got a bloody clue what I'm talking about. So you just have to wear that. And then this one of these young gay male comedian who, we were good friends. He was a fan of mine, my comedy. He was absolutely outraged. He said, I identify with the queer community. I support the queer community. This queer, this word's used now, and trans is a homophobic movement if you look closely at it, but if you look a little bit at it, obviously they're aligning themselves with it, with the rainbow. And so he just said, I said women experience a lot of violence. I said this in a private message to him, where we experience a lot of violence, and this is not going to help. We need our private spaces, we need our rights, we need sex to be defined. And he said, queer community experiences way, and he wrote 9 ways, way more violence. He's 25. He's been up there. He's won awards, comedy awards, but he just was absolutely insistent that the queer community, so that includes men, experience way more violence than women do. And again, this is my thesis subject, violence against women. So he's wrong. He couldn't be more wrong. But it's so sad that and he's a good guy, he was funny, but this just flipped him, in my opinion. He thinks it's flipped me.
Yeah, well, my experience is that, what I've observed is that somehow the neo-rainbow community is what I call them, have somehow claimed these words of the most discriminated against, the most vulnerable, the most like having
suffer the most violence.
Somehow they've claimed this expression the most, and even if it's not the most, it's like some of the most. But they've sold this to everyone, like the public service in general. Anyone who works in the public service is buying this and repeating it, and I think now. Somehow they've claimed those words for themselves and sold them, and they've been bought.
Well, it's because of the words themselves. They use the word transgender, and that's not actually a real thing. Instead of transvestites, people who dress as the opposite sex, particularly men, which were understood, that's a difficult way to be, but they'd chosen to be that way, and they were mostly welcomed. Now it's queer, and it can be anyone who identifies as queer. So that really is a recruitment word and concept. If you read on, that we haven't got time for all the background and how this all came about, but it really is quite deliberate. In fact, queer studies took over women's studies at the universities, and that was really a critical change, because queer is obviously gender neutral. That's its winning ingredient. Whereas women's studies, we were saying women are discriminated against in a specific way because of our sex, because of our biology, and this was a powerful movement, even though women's studies was always tiny. Like I said, feminism's never been in the mainstream. So it's not just, we may, we have a female prime minister, but turns out mostly they're not really true feminists. They're not going to fight for women. And, this queer thing comes up. And like that, women's right campaign for Jacinda. I've been campaigning for Labor for decades, but now, I'm with the Women's Rights Party, because they have just sold women out And they don't. The same in America. I mean, you read about it. It's horrendous and so corrupt. But really, it's about just appeasing men because they're angrier and they're scarier, and they're so persistent in saying that they're hurt, that they're entitlement, they're so wounded, and they're so aggrieved by J.K. Rowling and any of us saying, like this gay comedian, young comedian, he's, you know, charismatic and charming and successful at 25, you know, but he was so angry with me for suggesting that, you know, women's rights are affected by the, you know, trans activism, and claims that, you know, these people are more oppressed than women. And even more subject to violence than women. It's simply not true. For starters, we're physically weaker. So any man who is in that queer community is nowhere near as vulnerable to the violence, the sexual violence. They're not vulnerable to almost at all. As far as it being a stronger person, they, you know, might be, you know, gay men might be sexually abused, but it'll be by another man. And that when they're both men, the capacity for abuse and domination, physical domination and abuse, is much reduced. But also most men are heterosexual, so most men want to abuse women and girls. And this movement allows them into our spaces. Girls have already been raped in female toilets at a greater rate than happened before. And one of our horrendous members of parliament even defended the sex self-ID by saying, well, men have always had access to our spaces if they wanted it, rapists.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but we're making it easier for them. We're saying it's okay because of their feelings, the feelings of rapists, including in court. We have to call them women. If they say they're women now, rapists, we have to put them in women's prisons. We have to accept them in women's prisons. And women who are in prison, 99% of women who are in prison, and I got this through my research, I just haven't picked it off the top of my head like most people do, commenting on this thing. The vast majority of women prisoners are there because of male violence.
Yeah.
Or drugs, and they get into drugs and prostitution often because they're abused. So many girls are abused, sadly, in their families. And again, I've read an awful lot about that. All this, they're the greatest victims, and their feelings matter.
This thing about them, they're the greatest victims and everything like that. And I sort of say, well, where's the evidence?
Exactly.
And where's the evidence? And there's this whole thing about how they need to use women's spaces because they're victims, etc., in male spaces. And I say, where's the evidence? No evidence has ever been produced, as far as I know. It's just their stories, the anecdotal stories. Exactly. Now, I acknowledge that people's stories are important, but what about, where are women's stories? Women's stories are not considered to carry the same weight as those men's stories who say they need to be in women's spaces.
Yeah. And it's outrageous. It's so obviously, a con, because no one, these men aren't going to tackle a 6-foot man who turns up in a wig and heels. They know he's my husband's short for starters, but he's a decent person. He's not going to go anywhere near them. He's not going to trouble them at all. I mean, he'll also, be considerate. Men get so much more consideration than women do.
I suspect that, I really do suspect, and this is just as an opinion, that the number of men who say they're women who go into men's spaces like changing rooms, toilets, and get randomly attacked is far fewer than women in women's spaces where a man comes in and randomly, or girls, women and girls, and a man comes in and randomly attacks them,
or just pervs on them in the changing room, or listening to them on the toilets. You can read men's writing on this, that they do this. They listen to, they get off on sneaking into women's toilets. They don't have to sneak anymore. That's nice for them, isn't it? Yeah. And listening to us, go to the toilet. I mean, it's so different to being a woman. And they say they are women. If they want to do that, that is the opposite of anything. Women do not want to listen to anyone going to the toilet. Anyone. Why would you? Why? It's a madness that only men suffer, And I do know
Yeah.
that some men are not happy about, you know, the gender neutralizing of their facilities. Oh, my husband's one of them. But he's mainly on behalf of the women that he works with. He works with a lot of women, and they're just, you know, his toilets at the university, their toilets were gender neutralized, where the men's were kept, the women's were neutral, you know, made open to men. And the women were so upset by this. And I did tell you about I had a, you know, quite a sort of dealings with a trans comedian, male to female, in my comedy years in Auckland, and that one of his jokes was about, I say his now, I used to refer to him as with female pronouns, that he went into a bathroom facility at the airport, a female bathroom facility, and he'd only been on estrogen for like 6 months at this point. He looked just completely like a male, and he's big, middle-aged. And there were all these Asian women in there, and they screamed. And this was one of his jokes.
Yeah.
So that's not only horrendously sexist, but it's racist. And this goes down as comedy. That comedy is allowed in New Zealand in 2017 and 2018. That comedy is allowed. And
the funny thing is that they were
and
Asian.
people do laugh at it as well. So that's problematic, because that just shows you that that sexism, really, the feminism is very thin on the ground and always has been. We've been fighting from the margins forever for very basic rights, even though it looks like
when you said something, when you back a ways, when you said that when you started, I think in 2016 or something.
Yes. Yeah.
And then Trump was, and then Trump got elected, and then you went on to say something else, and I'm thinking, well, what is the significance of Trump being elected in there?
Well, that became I went on the Women's March, protesting that. We had a huge Women's March here.
Protesting what? Protesting Trump being elected?
Well, yeah, because Hillary was going to be the first woman Prime Minister of the United States.
Yeah.
And for feminists, we felt she was a true feminist at that point. Things have maybe changed since then, just like I thought Jacinda was a true feminist.
Yes.
Hillary, I think, was put in an impossible position thanks to what her husband did. But anyway, that's my feeling. But yeah, obviously people feel strongly about Hillary in so many different ways. But at the time, it seemed like it was a rip-off to women especially. And there was a massive protest across the world, you know, that Trump, who was basically an open misogynist, was elected instead of Hillary Clinton, who was he was not even an experienced politician, and she was out as experienced as you could be. And I don't believe this trans thing would have taken off if she'd been elected then.
You don't?
No, I don't. She's not she actually spoke out against trans. Her daughter was yes. Oh no, this is all cool. Yes. But she was it was brave considering that it's America, but she was convinced. This is my analysis. As I said, I've got a bit of credentials to seriously analyze such things, but there's only so much time in the day, and I'm sure there's stuff I've missed. But she has been convinced that because the Republicans get so much more money than the Democrats, that they have accepted this deal with the devil sort of thing with the trans activists, particularly Rachel Levine, who is high up in the Biden administration. And Biden announced on his first day in office that that trans rights is the new civil rights movement. First day in office. So that strongly suggests, and indeed if you read Jennifer Billick, the funding for the American Democrats has the billionaire trans families have had a lot to do with that going right back. And I think they worked to make sure Hillary Clinton didn't get elected.
So
didn't get the nomination.
I thought you said the Republicans got a lot more money than the Democrats, or did I?
4 times they get 4 times the funding.
So how does that? The Republicans get about 4 times the funding as the Democrats. So how did that then lead into what the Democrats were doing?
Well, because these trans activists, these billionaire, basically men who identify as women, there's a couple of key families, but there's some individuals as well, and they have stacks of money. They're billionaires.
Yeah,
and so they want to push the trans cause, and they either figured out that the left wing is more gullible, and they can make it look like a civil rights movement,
Yes.
which they very, very successfully did. Or they simply, said, we'll pledge this money if you do X, Y, Z, including pushing puberty blockers on kids, which is what Rachel Levine, he's a deputy admiral of health, and he's actively pushed puberty blockers on the entire world.
There's been quite a scandal, actually.
Through the political left wing that I've always supported.
Yeah.
So,
So how does that Trump being elected then? I'm just curious.
How does this was before
affect the New Zealand comedy circuit?
Well, as a feminist, and I just started comedy, then I thought Hillary was coming in and I could leave politics. Trump got in, and he's an open misogynist, and everyone, so, he was a controversial candidate. You remember the pussy grabbing incident?
Oh, yeah.
That was recorded. I mean, plus he ran Miss America, Miss Teen America, and there's all sorts of reports.
Pretty unsavory character.
But also he's stupid. Forgive me if that's not something that's approved to say. But he doesn't have any intelligence credentials for the job, and the way he ran COVID as well. I mean,
yeah. All right. So we don't want to talk about him too much, because I was just curious about why you brought him into it when. When Trump was elected, I was curious as to how that sort of.
I was trying to get out of politics, and a lot of people were making comedy around Trump. That was a big,
right.
It was a big deal for the.
So the big boss then, who's basically runs the comedy scene in New Zealand, runs the one and only comedy club, which I guess is in Auckland, and he gets funding. Does he?
He doesn't get funding for the he runs the older more professional competitions, so the Billy T awards, the Fred Dagg awards. So that's for the more semi professional comedians or professional comedians. It's all these sort of preliminary rounds are run through his club, so he would get some funding for that. And he also advertises the Raw Comedy Quest, that is a national comedy quest. So it draws candidates from Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin as well, but mostly, contestants, I should say. Most of them come because population numbers dictate from Auckland, which is his club. So I guess he doesn't directly manage decide the other comedians, but from what I could see, he's managing them as well. He's in cahoots with the Wellington mob, and then the others, he just has so much more power as he runs.
So he's so well entrenched, and of course New Zealand is such a small place that there really isn't room for someone else to set up in competition to him. Is that?
No, there isn't, and there really needs to be a national competition that's just impartial and with a panel of judges. That's from the heats, not just in the finals. The finals, they have a panel of judges, and he used to go on about how they're completely separate. But again, I have a lot of evidence to suggest they're not completely separate. So, that's when I was in the industry. So I think since then, because I made my complaint, that was a sex and age discrimination complaint, he has gone out of his way to promote a lot of women, and that's going to sound like they don't deserve it, but it's a mess because they've gone from one extreme to another. Now they're coming back again to men. That it just should be based on talent. God help us if we could just have everything based on talent and commitment and intelligence and all the things that matter. But rather than people's agendas, So that's what I feel like I've been fighting for all my life, and I didn't expect to have to fight for it in the comedy industry, though, because it was opening up to women. There was Hannah, then there was Ursula here, and they stood out because they kind of weren't there from the beginning, then they just turned up at a time when there were so many men continuing to be promoted, and their comedy was female, was very female, not just some female comedians sort of do the bro thing and kind of take the piss out of women.
Yeah.
You know, so it's sort of playing, use the
Yeah.
same kind of narratives that the male comedians use, but
Yeah. Yeah.
these two, Hannah, and I know Hannah's gone the other side of this trans debate as well. It's split the lesbian community as far as I can tell. Because the LGB Alliance in the UK has just had this fabulous conference, and our leader, Tanya Sturt, I don't know if I can mention her, but she attended that. Our leader of Let Women Speak over here. Yeah, and a whole bunch of young trans activists dumped 2 massive bags of thousands of live crickets, the LGB Alliance. So this is lesbians who are fighting to get the T out of their. This is lesbian and gay people and bisexual people fighting to get this, led by 2, mature age lesbian women who set it up 3 years ago. But anyway, so yeah, it's the rainbow. We're giving a conference without the T because most transsexuals are straight. That's the other thing. And most of the kids being transitioned are gay.
Yeah.
So it's not part of the rainbow. The rainbow is a con. The neo rainbow is a con. So these genuine same-sex attracted people or bisexual people were putting on this conference, and these young trans activists infiltrated the conference dressed as lesbians, let's say, if you like, probably shouldn't use that phrase, but and let out these. Have you seen that? You've seen the news on that? These crickets
About
into
these young girls. I think they were called
yeah, it
girls.
was girls. That's right.
I've heard them described as these young posh girls
Posh, all right.
releasing all these crickets. Yes, so
Yes.
they're not they. From what I understand, they weren't working class girls who came in doing this. They're posh girls with which is basically they were playing. They were having a game.
Yeah.
You know, because they can leave this anytime.
Yep.
And they'll be okay. They'll be fine. It's just it's just a bit of the left is a bit of a playground for them. Doing lefty stuff. And so anyway, as a vegan,
so gay people are resisting.
I'm particularly upset about the fact that they did that to all those crickets.
Oh yes, you're vegan. Yeah. Well, I know. I did see some pushback of that sort. That's almost funny, but yeah.
I know. And the first thing I thought about was, although like I didn't really think about the woman being upbeat or the attendees sort of being that upset, because I mean I knew they would, but I think I was indignant about sort of taking all these crickets and doing that to all these crickets. So they have to be killed and exterminated. It was really quite amusing where my first sort of
that is amusing, Katrina.
Indignation went to. Yeah. So
yeah, well, as I said, others have been expressing that thought too, but I can't stand, anything like that. So I'm immediately creeped out. And the fact that they all had to get up and go, having organised all that, to me was the greater crime there and tragedy. Though they did continue on, and it was apparently an amazing conference. And so in the UK, they are pushing back. It's so much work, though, isn't it? I don't know how much of it you keep up with, but bloody hell.
I do keep up with it quite a bit. Yeah, but it takes an enormous amount of time, and it also takes money, and the money is not not easy to come by when you're on this side of the situation. The other side, of course, you get the funding pours in. If you're a TQ plus lobby group or whatever, the funding pours in from everywhere.
It absolutely floods in. And I've just read in the Week on War and Women, Graham Linehan and JL's work that you probably are familiar with, but one of the there's a Supreme Court case that the women of Scotland have taken to clarify the definition of sex or definition of woman in the Sex Equality Act in the UK, because it's allowing men in, men who identify as women. And one of the leading judges, who's a man who identifies as a woman, he's been introducing in the UK, preferred pronouns and all their gender identity, having to be respected. So that's where you get rape victims having to call their rapists she and her penis. You get this. This is happening in England, you know, the home of the
Yeah.
Enlightenment, in Scotland, indeed. What? How unenlightened can you be? Getting a rape victim, she's the victim, having to, because of his feelings. He says he's a woman, and he's only just decided he's a woman. A lot of them just transition.
Oh, look, that's exactly right, Sasha.
When they're in court.
A lot of these
That's
men
even
discover their
okay.
gender dysphoria once they
Yeah.
get into the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Well, so this guy, he's now resigned. He was a High Court judge, and he was responsible for doing that, corrupting UK courts. Has been denied the right to speak at this Supreme Court hearing.
That's the man who says he's a woman who is a
judge.
Yeah.
He's been he's got a gender recognition certificate, which is
big deal.
So maybe we should give him that. But because he's corrupting women's rights so drastically, I don't want to use female pronouns for him.
No, I mean, look, a man with a certificate. Women are not just men with certificates.
No, indeed.
They're not just men. They're not just men without penises.
Yeah.
It's
and I mean,
ridiculous.
some of them, they are just living their lives, and I think JK is pretty supportive of them, and we're getting some fighting between women over this, between TERFs over this. So I think those that don't want to ruin women's lives and identify as women, that are fine and have been fine for a while. I can also go the other way and say that it shouldn't be allowed at all, legally at least. But the ones that, like this judge I just mentioned, that are actively trying to reduce, if not eradicate, women's rights, to say we need separate sex facilities, services, sports, and rights that are based on our biological sex. We shouldn't have to say biological sex, just our sex. It's a biological concept. And gender identity is made up. These men make it up and say that they're women, like Eddie Izzard, that says he always felt like a woman inside, but that's not what he was feeling. He was feeling like he got aroused dressing in his mother's undergarments. Girls don't do that. Did you wear your mother's undergarments? You might have put her shoes on. You might have put a dress on to look like a lady, but you don't. It's not sexual.
It's always about the clothes and the underwear, isn't it? It's never about, I really realized I was a woman when I saw my mother vacuuming, and I really wanted to get on the end of that vacuum cleaner and and do the vacuuming. It was never that. It's always about the clothes and the underwear.
And Stephen Hawking says he doesn't understand women. Well, look, these guys haven't got a bloody clue either. If Eddie Izzard can stand there looking absurd in this dress and say, he understands what women are going through, and he is a woman and describes himself more as a woman than a man increasingly. He just shows how little he knows about what women are, what we need, what it is to be a woman. And obviously, I don't want to be cruel. None of us want to be cruel, but it's just, can we have some of that compassion for our side? And just, it's such a fight to just be heard.
I think a lot of us are realizing now this "don't want to be cruel" thing has been
weaponized.
It's just it has not served us well. So we're pretty angry and devastated about how that has been manipulated and weaponized, and there are many of us that are thinking, right, we cannot afford to be that anymore. Anyway, let's go back to you. Do you see any future? Is there a future for you in the comedy circuit in New Zealand?
Well, I've been sort of indirectly encouraged to apply for the Auckland Comedy Festival, or New Zealand Comedy Festival. I beg your pardon. It's held in Auckland. But and I have applied a couple of times, but this was back before I made my human rights complaint. So and those applications were rejected. But conceivably on the grounds that I was too new. But I went on to produce. But I don't think those were the reasons. As I said, I think that was this man blocking my progress. But it's been a long time since then, and I think it's possible he's had a change of heart, because he, as I said, was pretty clear he didn't want me to leave the comedy industry. But if I was going to stand my ground and say this shouldn't have happened, this was not a fair competition, then I wasn't welcome. So I had to play it on his terms. But I think, in the whatever years it's been, 5 6 years since that complaint, he maybe misses my comedy, and feels a bit bad that maybe he would allow me to apply for the New Zealand Comedy Festival, but I just didn't trust that, so I'm applying for Melbourne first, and they're very woke as well. They just don't know. I mean, I'm telling the world now if people watch this, and I don't know. I'm an open book. I'm a memoirist. I believe in telling the truth. My truth's quite a hard one, and but I've been cancelled anyway, and I've got writing to fall back on, I suppose. I had to self-publish my book, which is feminist, and it touches on the trans debate. I'm going to get it.
This one, The Fatter Sex. Yes.
Yeah, it's about a plan for women's weight, health, and humour. So as you can see, it's got a bit of a funny tone to it, and I use the word humour because that's the mental health there. That as well. There's a lot of I talk about comedians in the dessert section because I write it as a woman you, not a menu, but a woman you, and so it's all all structured as different courses like you would have in a menu or woman you. And the final course is the dessert, and that's for female comedians, and many of them are sort of, relaxed about their body image, let's say, and like Sarah Millican and Ursula as well, and that kind of, even Rebel Wilson has suggested that being overweight is even a plus in the comedy world for a woman, and that even she maybe gained weight partly for that reason. So I'm looking at fat activism, the positives and the negatives. But yeah, if you can be genuinely happy when you're significantly overweight and make good comedy out of that, well, I reckon you've won the body battle. That's what I say. But I don't think it's healthy. Fat activism is healthy in general, and I also explain that with many examples. Case studies of how anorexia as well as extreme obesity, both of which are eating. I think they're close cousins. They're two sides of the same coin. Really, it's just trying to battle with female puberty that is so challenging, and some just don't eat, they undereat, and my daughter has sort of done both, and others just eat because we're programmed to be fatter. That's why I call it the fatter sex. We're programmed to store carbohydrates. We've got a slower metabolism, and we're programmed to eat carbohydrates because we bleed. In puberty, this is so. Before puberty, girls and boys about the same weight. And it just wait for their height, etc. And it often goes very wrong for girls though in this in puberty, and it did for me. I was a ballet dancer, so that complicated that. This is not my comedy story, but it is related to everything I do, I suppose, and it is feminist, and the current battles that young people are having, particularly young girls, with this trans gender ideology being so widespread, is that now they're getting another way that they can escape their female pubescence and adolescence, and they're being told that they can basically identify as the other sex, and they can bound their boobs or get thousands apparently have had their boobs cut off. This is teenage girls and young women
around the world you're talking about.
Yes, around the world. That's the statistic that I've, the studies that I've come across. Mostly in America.
Sasha, I was angry at when puberty happened. I didn't want it. I was angry at it, and I can understand these. I'm not going to say that I would have been one of them, but I can understand that sentiment.
Yeah.
And as I often say, somewhere between the ages of 15 and 16, my mental and emotional maturity developed enough to align with what my body was doing.
Well,
but before then I hated it, and I can absolutely understand how nice it would have been not to have had breasts or a period until about that time.
Yes. Well, I didn't menstruate or have breasts till 19 because I was a skinny ballet dancer and manic dieting.
Oh,
But
lucky
I
you.
was also using laxatives, and then later I became a horrendous bulimic.
Right, another
It's
story.
quite funny, my story. If you want to read it, it's quite funny because it actually caused my infertility for some years. But we got there in the end, and I read on all this. So I've read up. I went to an eating disorder counsellor in New Zealand, and the first thing this woman did was weigh me, and I was just, oh, you've got to be kidding me. I was in floods of tears because I'd put on 4 stone since I was 18, and I was 23 at that point. So that's a lot of weight to gain in 5 years. And obviously I still had that ballet mentality. But I don't think it needed. So I talk about eating disorder counselling and prevention counselling. That's what I reckon women, mothers and daughters need. I think it's an absolute, because I've got so many mother-daughter case studies in the book. We need help. And because it's just way more complicated with more food that's shoved down our faces. And now when you've got body positivity activism, which just is love your body, whatever size it is, weight doesn't matter at all, which obviously is lovely on the one hand, but it's harming.
But it does matter. Yeah. I mean, women's bodies are just more complex. That's just the way of things, you know.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we just have to acknowledge that and address it, and just not try and pretend that somehow or another we can fit into a man's way of doing.
Well, sure. Everything, a lot of health medicine and research is based on male subjects and students, and even male lab rats and what have you. They don't even consider the female differences in their research. This is this is doctors who were trained in the 90s.
More complicated and more costly. Sort of women's bodies basically more complex and basically in a way more costly. But I balance that out and I say, well, in actual fact, how costly are men to the world? You know, and when you think about violence to property and people and things like that. So I sort of object to this sort of unsaid but unspoken sort of insinuation that, you know, women are costly.
Well, we also produce the babies that will be your workers and all the businesses that the people exploit those babies for more money than they than they are paid. So our bodies value for money compared with male bodies, quite frankly.
That's the way
in fact, someone did cost out the cost of domestic violence, the economics of it, and it was huge. The annual cost of domestic violence to productivity was absolutely massive. And this was back in the 90s, I think. This woman did this research and costed it all out, as if trying to get some additional motivation for governments to take action. It didn't. It was definitely reported, but it
didn't result in anything. Hey, so when are you going to? When will you know whether or not you've been accepted into the 2025 Melbourne Comedy Festival?
I've got a deadline in a week that I've got to. So I haven't applied yet. But I ummed and ahed at length about the TransTasmanian. Did I show you the poster?
I'm not sure. No, show me again.
Well, it's quite hard to get it the full
in one screen. Okay.
So then it says TransTasmanian.
TransTasmanian, yeah. I should imagine that'll go down like a cup of cold sick.
Well, it's funny, and I do straddle the ditch. So it's just using that word for a different purpose. And I said, obviously I'm a TERF, but I get that, I'm a feminist really. So it's just, I don't want to be, the whole trans agenda to stuff my feminism. My feminism is ancient. And and I've got so much feminist related comedy that's my life related too. I'm a mother and I'm a wife and I'm a comedian in an industry that, is challenging for older women. So, that's all basic feminist stuff that I can use there. But you've got to give your show a title. And I just thought, given that it is in Australia and I'm living in New Zealand and I was born and bred in Australia and I've been back and forth, I think it's the perfect title for this age. We can call it the age of trans maybe, but as I said, that's not all that's going on, obviously. But yeah, Australia's got it quite bad with the Sal Grover case. They proves that, and self ID's going to go through New South Wales soon. I just can't believe, with all the evidence, the harms it causes.
Unbelievable, eh? It's just mind-boggling. And
yeah.
there's a significant comedian in Australia who just recently got cancelled, didn't she?
Yeah, well, yeah, Betty McLaughlin, is it? I think Betty's the first name, and she's the daughter of another famous female comedian, and I'm going to forget her name as well. But anyway, yeah, she's in Adelaide, and she was, yeah, she's been overseas, and she's excellent comedian, original, brave, gutsy, and she was just told she went up to the guy who runs the pub that she lives near to, and she does a lot of her stand-up comedy in, and was hoping to host her comedy show there, in fact, in Adelaide, and she was known to already have sort of mentioned a few trans-related things in her just 5-minute sets that you do more regularly, and she wanted to put some of that into her show, and she asked the guy running the pub, who she knew well, and he said, no, we can't have that material. Like, she just told him it would be this, I'd be sensitive, I'd do it, I'm not going to do it in a hurtful
sensitive.
Yeah, I know. And he just said, look, I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. That was his comeback, and she knows that he's kind of bound to say that. Basically the pub owners, or whatever, the industry owners and gatekeepers have put these limits on. We don't want. I was actually told in Sydney at a comedy gig beforehand that there'll be no transphobia. There's zero tolerance for transphobia. He went out of his way, the guy running the club in Sydney, comedy club, to say this to all the comedians before we went on, so that if we had any material like that, we had to take it out like that. And this was another competition.
But you could be feminophobic, was okay.
Yes, it's all right to be sexist. There was nothing mentioned about sexism. Homophobia was mentioned, racism was mentioned, but transphobia was the first thing mentioned, and it seemed to me to be the thing that was emphasised. The irrational fear of trans is not even real, but that they've been very successful with these key terms, and transphobia is probably the key one, that it just makes us look phobic and narrow-minded and bigoted and prejudiced. We don't see them as people, we dehumanize them, when in fact they're doing all that to us. Yeah. If women, we can't have our language, we can't have our spaces, well, we're dehumanized. Yeah. If I'm a pregnant person, that was the first thing I reacted to, going way back when New Zealand just introduced that term into its legislation. We weren't pregnant women anymore, we were pregnant people.
I know. I mean, it's pretty nuts, yeah. And I kind of wonder, there will be a generation of kids coming through who will look at this younger generation now. Eventually, will be looked on with the same contempt that we're looked on now, but for a different reason. Because they'll be saying like, look what you did. You took our language out. You took our words out of the language. You let men into women's spaces. Yeah. You did all this to us. You took away all these rights that these women fought for. So they will be held in contempt, and if they don't see it now, they think that they are cutting edge, edge history, sort of social advancement, progression and stuff like that. So they don't see it now, but they will be held in contempt in years to come for what they've done. Yeah.
So that's how it works, Katrina. It really does. And sadly, each generation makes the same mistakes. Really, we've made some progress, but boy, was it a fight.
That's one thing you learn when you get sort of older, is you just sort of see the same things being done time and time and time and time again. They might have different sort of clothes on, so to speak, but they're done the same all the time. Yeah. Anyway, Sasha, look, when will you know about the Melbourne Comedy Festival?
Probably in a few weeks. Yes. I'm not sure how quickly they get back. I've not applied to them before, but as I said, the deadline's in a week, and for applications, I'm applying for festival assisted venues. Otherwise, it's it's just
Yeah.
too much of an undertaking to do in a different country and city. So, and because I'm a mid-season comedian, I've done 2 Auckland Fringe Festival shows, and they were successful. And I think my pitch is strong. So I'm going for these assisted venues. So that means the festival helps you set it up and pays for some of the costs. So that's if I don't get that. But I'm putting it right out there as TransTasmanian, so they could easily balk at that without even considering my pitch. So you don't really know. Things are changing, but I know someone in the arts community down there, and she's up in arms about it all. But she's just about silenced in terms of what she can say. And Melbourne is known as the most woke city in Australia, but they're really all a bit the same, it seems. Anyway, so I'll let you know, I guess, if what happens at least, and certainly if I get through.
And I'll put the link to where people can buy your book below. And if there's anything else that you want linked there for people to know about, you can just send that to me and I can add it.
Okay. Well, I've got my Substack, but maybe that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good one. So we'll put that in. Yeah.
All right, Katrina.
All right. So that was that great chat, Sasha. I keep on going to say Sasha. I apologise for that.
No, look, you're right.
Sasha. Yeah. And we'll chat again another time.
Hopefully. That's great. Thank you for having me, Katrina. It was great talking to you.
It was great. Bye.
Okay. See you later.